All right. Welcome back, everyone. So let's see here. So just a heads up, today I have the camera on top of the laptop, chat below. So if you see me looking down, I'm reading your chats. And have a few questions from last week as well, or week before. I don't think we did one last week. No, we did the Q&A, that's right, with Kay Rubicek on Saturday. And I apologize as well. I think I said I was going to do a live on Sunday too. It was a miscommunication because we did the Saturday, not the Sunday. I have Taiwanese tea today. Teapot my mom got me. So not doing the kombucha tonight, but yeah, good seeing you all here. All right, so I have a few questions from last week I wanted to get to first. Oh, someone's asking where's the YouTube music. I'm not sure actually how it works when I do the lives. I think when I do the lives, it doesn't do that. I have to click the button when the time comes on. I'm not sure if it does it naturally otherwise. All right, let me get to a couple questions that people left on Patreon and Facebook, and then we'll jump into the ones for tonight. As always, folks, I had some kombucha before the broadcast, but but as always, folks, if you have questions, leave them in the chat. I'll try to get to them. So let's see here. This is from Dina Rice Patzloff. Joshua, thanks for your commitment to finding and reporting the truth. My pleasure. Why doesn't anybody, the U.S. or the countries, do something about the CCP and all the horrible things they do to their own citizens? Why can't someone do anything about Nancy Pelosi and others who are blatantly lying about everything and trying to damage our country's system of government? Thanks. Keep up the good work. Really appreciate it. Thank you. When it comes to why countries, the U.S. or otherwise, haven't stood up to the Chinese Communist Party, actually, I would say that I honestly think it's been a miscalculation. I think there's definitely some special interest. I think definitely you have a lot of politicians, business leaders, academics, and so on who are in the Chinese Communist Party's pockets. I mean, the CCP, I often talk about it on the show. They have many programs targeting people to get them on their payrolls, to even if not directly for their payrolls, using legal means. For example, Big Pharma having, most of our medicine comes from China, Big Pharma working closely with China, and then Pharma lobbying Congress or lobbying politicians on behalf of their business interests, which include massive interests in the Chinese economy. You're talking about politicians who, want to try to negotiate peace, and maybe they believe in the United Nations, and then a lot of parts of the United Nations have leadership positions run by the Chinese Communist Party. If you're talking about, for example, academics, a lot of colleges take a lot of money from China. A lot of them have open, publicly disclosed research cooperation programs with the Chinese Communist Party. And if they talk badly about them, they lose that. A lot of them get a whole lot of money from Chinese students. And if you're thinking that they're lobbying government officials or talking, and these are the people journalists would go to interview typically, you have to think of how many, not just direct CCP influence, but how many business, academic, big pharma, big energy, you name it, are lobbying government officials when they have interest with the Chinese Communist Party. And so I think it's complicated from that standpoint that you have a lot of people with a lot of interest in China, not just direct influence, but even side influence, I guess we could call it, that has been very favorable of China. Look at Hollywood. Look at the media. How many of them are taking money from China daily? How many of them participate, for example, in the annual training sessions? How many of them participate, for example, in the annual training sessions on media stance of the state council run under Xinhua? In China, the way the Chinese Communist Party relays its narratives to the Chinese state media is under the state council, which is kind of like the government of China. They don't do that for the West. What they do instead is they have Xinhua run it, and Xinhua's under the state council, and Xinhua is basically a branch of it anyways. A lot of big media are partners on that. And so, again, direct influence, indirect influence, sometimes illegal influence, all playing a role in terms of how government policy has been shaped in regards to China. I would say that even now, if we go back and through different administrations, we can go back to Nixon. Nixon's idea was middle of the Cold War. We can't defeat both the Soviet Union and China. We need to strategically divide them. So what happens? They have the Amur Valley conflict, where the Soviet Union and the Chinese Communist Party have, a shooting war. They have a shooting war in the Amur Valley. Thank you, NKSB. Appreciate it. During that time, the United States sees a strategic opportunity to divide China and the Soviet Union. And so Kissinger, Nixon, you name it, they go and negotiate it. And sure enough, China breaks away to an extent from the Soviet Union, at least on the surface. Some experts would argue that it was more of a show on their part, that they strategically went along with it. And even Vietnam is well on this. During the Vietnam War, for example, the Viet Cong, they would side sometimes with the Soviets, sometimes with the Chinese Communist Party, which angered the Chinese Communist Party, which is why the CCP invaded Vietnam after the U.S. pulled out of it. They had a hot war. They had a shooting war. Now, that allowed the Chinese Communist Party access into a lot of, international institutions. It allowed them to really flourish, as much as they could under a communist system. Which ties into some of the Rothschild banking. That's right too. A lot of big banks poured money into China. A lot of foreign investment into China, and there were a lot of people interested in that as well. But what happened? The CCP tries to take credit for uplifting the Chinese people out of poverty. Let's be clear: the CCP did not uplift the Chinese people out of poverty. Western capitalism uplifted China out of poverty, at least to an extent. It wasn't the Chinese Communist Party that did that. It was money from the West and innovation from the West and technology from the West pouring into China through these programs. It allowed the Chinese Communist Party to basically keep up what it's doing, unfortunately, but also improve the living standard to an extent in China. Wow, I appreciate the donations, everyone. Thank you. Now, moving on, we can go to the Bush administration. We can go to the Obama administration. We can go to the Clinton administration, Bill Clinton. All of them had different stances of trying to basically tolerate the Chinese Communist Party, working with them to an extent. Maybe there was a bit of special interest involved. Being fair, we can say that, well, maybe they thought China could change. If they believe that communism, because it is a communist system, if they believe communism is just an economic system, and if you bring capitalism to it and allow them to trade and you bring capitalist ideas, obviously from that standpoint, they're going to become capitalistic, not communist, and it's going to change the system. They didn't realize the CCP, what they do is, state capitalism. Chinese Communist Party runs the private businesses. They can nationalize private businesses. And instead of becoming more free, the Chinese Communist Party made the entire world less free. And through their control of institutions, through their programs of subversion, ideological warfare, ideological subversion, you would call it, they managed to really export a lot of their interests abroad. And so now we're at this state. Trump comes in. I think originally Trump, he understood we had bad trade deals with China. Trump, I think, went into office. If you read his policy book, Crippled America, he understands a lot of the trade deals that were negotiated in the past did not really benefit Americans. And of course, his main stance is he's fighting for, the Americans. Hey, Stone 420, good to see you here, man. Fighting for Americans and trying to renegotiate these bad trade deals. Remember, before the CCP virus outbreak, it did actually seem that Trump was going to make a trade deal with China. And sure enough, that happened. The virus broke out, spread around the world. Trump seemed to have seen the nature of the CCP, as did many countries. I would say the stance, not just of the United States, but a lot of different countries really changed. You could see Australia change their stance on China. You could see Angela Merkel changed her stance on China. You can see Modi in India. You can see Japan having changed its stance. All these different countries. Why is that? It's because during the outbreak, the world saw the hostile nature of the CCP, and they realized just having fair trade deals with China will not cut it. I do think now going forward, people are more willing to call out China. So back to your question, I would say that one of the reasons why other countries have not really called out the CCP until now is because they thought China could change. And I honestly think that they believed, I think a lot of politicians actually did believe that China was not as bad as guys like me The Chinese Communist Party is not as bad as guys like me were saying. I think they figured that the hardliners, that the China hawks were exaggerating. They didn't understand the real nature of it, and so I think just that was their stance, and I think that position has now changed. All right, let me get to a couple more, and then we'll jump into the questions for today. This is from Ja. Mr. Philipp, I have a theory and just wanted your thoughts on it. The way I understand it, the Chinese Communist Party officials, sorry. Again, I got some Taiwanese tea today. So my mom bought me this nice teapot. All right. Oh, well, I appreciate the donations, everyone. Let me try to get to your questions, but let me get through these ones first. All right, this is from Ja again. Mr. Philipp, I have a theory and just wanted your thoughts on it. The way I understand it, the Chinese Communist Party officials that Hunter Biden is involved with are the Jiang faction. Xi Jinping could do his party purge by accusing the Jiang Zemin faction of American collusion and most likely give them the death sentence. I thought it was a little odd that the FBI would release such damaging information on the Bidens, unless the CCP had something to do with it. If Joe Biden wins, of course, Kamala Harris will be made president. And also, all of this could be a distraction from Hillary Clinton's own email scandal. Either way, the Bidens are no longer useful and will be made irrelevant. Do you think it's possible, or am I stretching it? Thank you. Okay, so here's my take on it. I would say that I would say that the Chinese interest in the U.S. elections are mixed. I do think it is a factional thing. It does seem the Jiang faction is trying to seek favor with the Trump administration, whereas the Xi faction is backing the Joe Biden administration. The Joe Biden campaign. That does seem to be the case. The CCP isn't trying to interfere in the elections. They've come out even publicly, in fact, through their state-run media, and they've endorsed Joe Biden, which is ironic because an endorsement like that, you would think that it would have the opposite effect. If a foreign government comes out and endorses a presidential candidate. So the Xi Jinping faction, they do not want Trump to win. This is public. They publicly endorsed Joe Biden. They do not want Trump to win. We talk about foreign interference in the elections. China is doing everything they can on that note. When it comes to the Xi Jinping faction, of course, this is based on the idea that Trump is a very hardline. He has a very hardline stance on the CCP. If you remember the debates between Kamala Harris and Pence, Harris actually criticized the Trump administration of being too hard on China. The Biden Kamala campaign, they're arguing basically that Trump's stance on China has failed, that being too hard on them has failed, that this is backfiring. That's their stance. Very likely, remember going back during the Obama administration when Joe Biden was vice president, Obama had the Asia pivot. Biden was put in charge of that. And during that time, that was when they made some of the business deals where Hunter Biden came back with over $1 billion in deals from China. Biden does have ties with the Xi faction on that note. And, very likely they do want him to, this isn't a secret. At the same time, though, the Jiang faction has been coming out, and you might have seen the news, allegedly, that they provided the Trump administration and the Justice Department, I believe, with 3 hard drives, allegedly with incriminating evidence against Joe Biden. Now, we've not seen anything on that. This is purely at the rumor stage, but there have been some reports on it. And at the same time, Guo Wengui, the Chinese billionaire, is making information public, and he credits the grandson of Jiang Zemin as one of the sources for it. Of course, Guo Wengui, this Chinese billionaire, defected from the CCP, and he's since turned against the Jiang faction. In fact, last year, he talked about how the Jiang faction had embezzled $1 trillion in China, and he alleged that they put half that money overseas. But he does have this blackmail information. If you go to his website, you can see some disturbing images and videos of Hunter Biden. And so the Jiang faction does seem to be interested in helping Trump go after Biden. He does not seem to have used that information yet. And so I think it's a very complicated situation. I think that Oh wow, Winnie Shi Poo, thank you. Actually, everyone really appreciate the donations. Thank you. Let me keep my mind on, on the topic though. So when we get into the factional battles with this, the Xi faction does not want Trump to win. They really don't want Trump to win, mainly because what Trump is doing with his trade policies is damaging the Xi faction. The Jiang faction internally in China is trying to pull a Hail Mary, and they're trying to retake the controls of the CCP from the Xi faction. They seem to like the fact that Xi's image is being damaged because a lot of the deals he's made and a lot of the moves he's made have really failed. And so it does seem to be that they're trying to feed the fires in order to make Xi look bad, in order to make Xi look worse within the CCP. And they very likely do believe that Trump's going to win, which is why they provided information at the final hour, allegedly that Trump could use if he so choose to really damage the Biden image if he wanted to. Or he's just trying to curry favor with the Trump administration going forward. Either of these are possible. Personally, I think that Trump should be extremely cautious with dealing with Jiang in any way. And this is one of the complicated things you have. This is one of the complicated things you have in China. Yes, look, okay, Xi Jinping is a dictator. He's the head of the Chinese Communist Party. Jiang is also a dictator. He would be just as bad. The problem with China is the Chinese Communist Party itself. Just getting rid of one leader is not going to change things. And so you have, well, Jay Otterson, appreciate it. And so you have in China the situation where, a lot of the information that's leaked abroad, you have to really consider the factional influences behind it. A lot of things aren't as simple as they seem. When I see a lot of journalists, for example, just going after Xi Jinping and not the CCP, they're saying, oh, there needs to be a regime change in China, or a leadership change, not a regime change. Oftentimes I'm wondering, okay, what is their source? Was it some Jiang faction crony who's feeding them leaks intentionally to, cause damage? Epoch Times, we get a lot of leaks from China, actually, but you have to really understand the factional interests behind things in order to not get used by them. So Joseph Assi, don't be a Xi lover. Yeah, don't worry. I'm not trying to defend Xi in any way here. Don't get me wrong. I'm saying the problem is the Chinese Communist Party itself, that includes Xi, that includes Jiang. But if you just get rid of Xi, Jiang faction is going to take over. It doesn't solve anything with China. All right, let's see if there's questions for today. Let's see here. So let me try to get to some of the ones we had. Tokyo's Dolphin 94. Chris Kumuro, thank you for the donation. Appreciate it. This is from Tokyo's Dolphin 94. Oh, also, I don't know if you folks noticed, I got this, I don't know what you call them, the soft thing that goes on the microphone. I think some of you mentioned that the microphone was popping. I hope this makes the quality better. Anyways, do you think the United States will benefit from decoupling from the CCP? I think they would. I think they need to, and I think they need to bring the whole world with them. The Chinese Communist Party, one of its big pushes right now is trying to establish global alliances. Already they control a lot of Latin America. They control a lot of Africa, which have been blind spots in U.S. policy, really. The United States needs to do more to engage with Latin America. This is a big reality, and the CCP has a lot of influence there. Same thing with Africa. They do a lot of the infrastructure projects. Oh, good. It does work. Thank you, everyone. It's a problem. You have countries that are not favorable to the CCP, like Brazil, for example. Bolsonaro does not like the CCP. At the same time, they're pretty clear that, if the U.S. doesn't offer some kind of infrastructure plan or some kind of foreign policy plan that really engages these countries with the types of trade deals and such that they need, China's going to steamroll it. They're going to come in. They're going to build the thing. They're going to build these things, and the U.S. isn't going to stop them. When it comes to decoupling from China, the U.S. should decouple from China, but at the same time, the U.S. needs to build alliances with countries where the CCP is trying to challenge U.S. interest. The U.S. needs to do this. Otherwise, the U.S. is going to be separate from China, and the CCP is just going to engage with other countries and form its own alliances, which it's doing. Michael Baker, Joshua, do you think the CCP is deliberately trying to interfere with the election? Yes, I do. And in fact, there've been a lot of there's been a lot of information on this. So you all might have seen the reports. Russia is trying to interfere with the elections. Actually, intelligence community, the intelligence community assessment on that actually said that China as well. A lot of media just left that out. China, Russia, the Chinese Communist Party. Sorry, China, Russia, and Iran. I'm sorry, have all been playing parts in this. China is the biggest by far. Chinese Communist Party, General Political Department, Liaison Department. They have an entire military branch dedicated to political warfare. This is a big thing they do. And also remember, one of the reasons why the Chinese Communist Party, why the Soviet Union had so much influence during the Cold War, and why they lost a lot of that. Russia does not have the same influence outside of the European continent that it used to, which is because they've lost the diaspora, they've lost the grassroots support. Remember that during the Cold War, you had the global communist revolution. If you were a member of the Communist Party, it meant you swore loyalty to the Soviet Union. College professors, college kids, celebrities, many of them, journalists traveling to Russia, going on press tours, reprinting Soviet propaganda, pumping up their image for them. It was very much like China today. And there was a lot of grassroots support for the global communist revolution, which the Soviet Union was running. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, all that grassroots support died, meaning that Russia lost that grassroots influence. In order to carry out real political warfare operations, you need that. Otherwise, you're limited to energy control, like Russia does right now, and some degree of cyber operations. It's not that much. They control a lot of Europe through energy, natural gas, which, if you remember, and also through atomic nuclear energy. If you remember, that was one of the big controversies around Uranium-1. And when the Obama administration, through Hillary Clinton and others, allowed Russia to buy up control of a lot of the global uranium mines, which was at a time when they had assessed that Russia was trying to use energy as a form of control over Europe. That is one of the few forms of control Russia still has. One sec. Now, the Chinese Communist Party, on the other hand, does have that grassroots influence. They have, for example, the Tongs. They have, for example, the United Front. They have influence through business, big pharma. How much medication comes from China? Ironically, the drug industry. Ironically, manufacturing, the textile industry, automotive industry. A lot of them were manufacturing in Xinjiang, funny enough, using slave labor. I mean, dark humor, I guess. Because these are the same companies that are trying to play all these race politics in the U.S. Meanwhile, they're using slaves. How many academics support China? How many of them take money from the Chinese Communist Party? How many different universities have been found to have been accepting millions of dollars from the CCP? What's it, like $6.5 billion, the recent assessment on how much money different universities are taking from China? These are the people giving interviews to the big media. These are the people writing a lot of the policy papers, a lot of the reports that are used to form U.S. government policy. How many think tanks are working with China? And so when you're talking about interfering with the election, there's direct influence and there's indirect influence, again, because of all the, channels the CCP has built into our society. And so, yes, they have huge influence, and their ability to carry out political warfare in the United States is massive, not to mention direct control through politicians who've sold themselves out to the CCP and others. This is from June Laran Ong. If Trump wins, what would his policies with China look like for the next 4 years? I think if Trump wins, we're going to see him continuing the hardline approach to the CCP. One of the things the CCP is doing right now is they're doing this whole hardline wolf warrior diplomacy. They kind of backed up off it a little bit, but they haven't really dropped it fully. And as they become hostile, as they threaten the United States, the Trump administration doesn't play those games. You don't threaten Trump and he's going to turn around and make a deal with you. No, he's going to cut deals with you. That's how he rolls. So, for example, the Chinese Communist Party just recently, after the U.S. arrested several accused Chinese spies of being tied to the Chinese military, the Chinese Communist Party threatened, tit for tat retaliation against Americans in China. Do you think that that is going to work with Trump? No, it will not. It might work under Biden. You might remember the deals the Obama administration made with Iran, for example, the Iran deal at the same time when Iran was abducting U.S. sailors. The Biden administration very likely would take a softer line on that. If we look at the Iran deal as an example of that. The Trump administration very likely going forward is going to become much, much stronger on China. I think this is the trajectory we're looking at. Denise Coop, good to see you here. And I appreciate the donation as well. Have you heard about Antifa getting a hold of the plans for major cities' infrastructure to flood into police departments, attacking them, and surrounding the White House to attack it if Trump wins? I have not heard about that. I'll keep an eye out for it. It wouldn't surprise me. You would only assume they would be looking at things like that. And these individuals are pretty extreme, to be honest. If Trump wins, I think he will move forward to make Antifa a terrorist organization. I think he will try to do that. Going forward, Linda Manning. What is the difference between communism in Vietnam and China? Vietnam seems a little more free. Oh, wow. Appreciate the donations. Thank you. Vietnam, yes, Vietnam is a communist country, one of the few remaining true, outright communist countries in the world. It's hard to say how their system's different. They are a little more free. They're not as hardline as the CCP. They don't have the same high-tech social control systems. The government is, of course, communist. But it's true, they don't exert control over the country to the extent the CCP does. The Chinese Communist Party has a much deeper, more totalitarian and more globalist, ironically, approach while having internal nationalism, which is one of the ironies when people try to define the only difference between communism and fascism as being, nationalist or internationalist. A lot of communist systems are both simultaneously. The Soviet Union was nationalist internally and internationalist externally. They were trying to push for the global revolution at the same time as running their own internal policies. The Chinese Communist Party is the same way. They talk a lot about nationalism internally while at the same time having global programs for globalist agendas. Oftentimes you find a bit of both with these things. Vietnam doesn't seem to be interested in that to an extent. They don't seem to be that interested in pushing beyond their own borders. At the same time, they really don't get along with China. The CCP and Vietnam really don't get along with each other. And Vietnam has also been wary about building international alliances as well. Basically, the reason they do this is because going back in the past, most of their alliances tend to backfire. They just had bad experiences with it. Of course, there's a lot of other issues in the East Asia, Southeast Asia region. For example, Vietnam influence over Cambodia, etc. Going back to, what happened after the end of the Vietnam War, for example. James Johnson, appreciate the donation. Thank you. Is adding authoritarian to capitalism a new term? Was there ever an authoritarian capitalist system? I'd say there is. Look, I'm very anti-socialist. No, I'm not trying to pull any punches here. Very anti-communist. At the same time, I think crony capitalism or capitalism with, socialist influences is a big deal too. In fact, I think the corporate reforms that introduced socialist policies into the corporate models are terrible. And remember, some of the original plans for socialism involved syndicalism, the idea of a socialist state run through big corporations. Socialism isn't just economic socialism or, this social justice type system that we have today. There were many different proposals for what socialism would look like. Among them, syndicalism, basically socialism run through unions. The idea, for example, socialist, basically mega corporations acting as the de facto governing forces in the country. Imagine like Silicon Valley, country, Silicon Valley national type policy. There are systems like that as well that have been proposed in the past. You remember that when, for example, Ford was supporting fascism, that was his grounds for it. He believed that fascism, for example, Henry Ford, he believed that fascism, for example, was based on the factory system, which is what he supported. Fascism was understood until the collapse of the Soviet Union until after World War II, as being just another type of socialism. So it was not National Socialism or Nazism. These were generally accepted. Among the books you can read on that, Richard Pipes. Let's see here. Among the books you could read on this, Russia Under the Bolshevik Revolution by Richard Pipes talks very in depth about this. Road to Serfdom by F.A. Hayek goes very much into depth about this. Socialism by Ludwig von Mises goes very into depth about this. It was very well accepted, until the end of World War II, that National Socialism or Nazism and fascism were just different forms of socialism. And of course, there are many different types of socialism. There were many different proposals of it, even at the time of Marx. And many of them did not recognize the next one. They did not get along with each other. And so just like today, you have a lot of different brands of socialism, and they'd argue the next one is not real socialism. And I think this has led to the problem now where, Ludwig von Mises pointed this out, that a lot of times the people complain about in the US or other countries when it comes to interventionist policies and government policies and big corporations and these things, the problems of these are rooted in socialist elements that were introduced into our institutions, going back very far. A lot of people who complain about these things are complaining about the introduction of interventionist policies that come from socialism, introduced into the corporate system, introduced into different forms of government, and so on. And so, yeah, I do agree. There is authoritarian capitalism. I think big corporate socialism is just as terrible as big government socialism. I don't want either, personally. Yeah, and that's true. Communism and capitalism, they often work hand in hand. Can we name? Capitalism. How do you want to define it? Right? I'd say interventionist capitalism, crony capitalism is the problem. I would say true free trade and policies to restrict companies from abusive acts that could eliminate the ability for people to start small businesses or compete in the free market. I'd say that needs to be stopped by government. I don't believe in absolute free trade and allowing big corporations to just steamroll people. I don't believe that's a good thing. But I think the problem is we don't have real capitalism. That's the problem. And I think when people think of the problems of capitalism, a lot of times what they're blaming are problems introduced through the corporate reforms and also through syndicalist unions. All right, moving on. Scotty Clevenger. Why does the Democratic Party want to push socialism so much? Is it to stay in power? Hard to say. If you go back to I don't want to go too far back, but if you go back into the early forms of, Stone 420, cracked me up, man. Just ordered Pipes' book. Yeah, unfortunately, I actually wanted to get Richard Pipes on my show. He unfortunately passed away not too long ago. I think within a couple of years ago, he passed away. I was really sad to see it, actually. Getting to the question. Why does the Democratic Party want to push socialism so much? Is it to stay in power? It's hard to say the nature of them. They've always been the liberal party. And I think the funny thing with liberalism, I like a lot of the classical liberals. F.A. Hayek was a classical liberal, as was, for example, Frederick Bastiat, one of my favorite writers, actually, Frederick Bastiat. Let me see here. Bastiat's most famous work was The Law, which is a very short book. It's very good. He also has a very large collection of writings, which I highly recommend. Bastiat was great. I really enjoy his writings. He was a classical liberal, as was to an extent Ludwig von Mises. In fact, you could say that the libertarians of today are more liberal actually than the Democrats are. I think the problem you have with absolute liberalism, absolute tolerance, in a way, is that it ends up breeding its opposite. I think when you push anything to its extreme, you end up having issues. When you talk about absolute tolerance, then you don't have a moral baseline anymore. And when you don't have a moral baseline, what is intolerable is a baseline. And I don't know if this makes sense, but let me try to explain my thought on this. Yeah, I'll get to more on this. This is just my understanding, the way I've been thinking about this lately. The problem is, for example, if you believe in tolerating anything, then having any type of morality, believing anything is bad, means that you think something is bad. And if you think something is bad, then you're a bigot, you're a racist, or whatever. You're discriminating against someone because you believe that one element of, behavior is not right. And so if you have morals of any kind, if you're dealing with an individual who believes in absolute liberalism, if you believe in values of any kind, it means that you oppose one thing in society, and there are people who believe in that thing you're opposing. Thereby, you're a bigot. And it's a downward trajectory that is self-destructive, because the goal, the inevitable outcome of that type of thinking is basically the annihilation of morals, right? It is zero, yeah, exactly, zero morals eventually. And what becomes evil then in that case? Well, it's having morals. The bad people are the ones who oppose the thing you're trying to push for, right? And so, ironically, their absolute tolerance leads to an intolerance of people who have morals. And I think that's the state of the world we have right now, where you have people who believe in absolute liberalism, absolute tolerance, absolute equality, and these types of things. And so anybody who believes in any kind of morality is therefore a Nazi or a hater or whatever else, right? And I think socialism really latched on to that type of thinking is what you have, because they use this as a talking point. And really, it doesn't represent that. Socialism is just the dictatorship of the proletariat. Socialism doesn't get rid of big corporations. It doesn't get rid of factories. It doesn't get rid of any of that. All it is, and which is why all the big billionaires and all the big investors and all the big bankers and all the big corporate heads tend to support policies that would lead to that. It's because it means they get state subsidies. They don't go away. They just get state subsidies. They become state-run institutions, and they get to dominate the entire market. So there's no possibility of competition. The individuals like you and I are denied from accessing the market, and the people who are currently in charge basically just become, basically CCP officials or officials within the new, dictatorship of the proletariat. They become the absolute rulers. If we go back into the history of the Democratic Party, actually they go back to the Democrat societies, which actually, a lot of people talk about George Washington and how he opposed. A lot of people say George Washington opposed the party systems and stuff. It actually wasn't. It wasn't like that. If you read his letters, he was talking about something very different. And you can read his letters, which is Writings of George Washington, also very good. Washington believed that the democratic societies were going to be the destruction of the nation. America was not a democracy. America is a constitutional republic. And he believed that absolute democracy would be the downfall of the republic system, as it was for the Greeks, as it was for the Romans. It was something that led to dictatorship. He did not want that. Now, he argued, funny enough, if you want to get to the real letters, it's ironic because it ties into conspiracy stuff. But basically, if you read the letters where Washington's talking about this, there's this individual saying, Washington, have you heard about the Illuminati? Have you heard about the the Freemasons trying to take over, the French Revolution and so on? Washington, and he sends them the book. I think it was, Proofs of a Conspiracy Against All Nations and All Religion, or something like that. It was a book warning about these things at the time of the French Revolution. There were a couple books like that. Let me get into this. And so he was asking Washington if he heard about it, and he enclosed in his letters a copy of that book to Washington, warning about what he believed was the threat of, global dictatorship and the plan for it to destroy governments and to destroy religion under what he called, under what was masqueraded, what was in fact the Illuminati of Bavaria and the Freemasons. Washington clarified in following letters, yes, I've heard of it. I have not seen these influences in the United States. Washington was a member of the English branch of the Freemasons. What do you call it? There were three branches. There was the Grand Orient, the Scottish Rite, which were the ones you had in Europe, which were the ones that were accused of being involved in these things. And then you had the English lodges, which was the one in the United States. And basically, if you read these letters, they did not allege that the English lodge, the one in the United States, was part of that. Washington said he had not seen those influences in the United States, but he said in the United States, these operations are being done under the Democrat societies. And the Whiskey Rebellion, which Washington put down through military force, he said was caused by those elements. And so basically the Democrats grew out of that. I mean, how it is. And, so Washington was warning about it from the get-go. The Democrats have always been pushing, the Democratic Party from the get-go, from the very founding of this country, has been pushing for basically socialist system in line with the French model, later on into different forms of socialism. This has always been the case. It's interesting history if you read it, actually. All right, Joe B. And sorry, I know it sounds like conspiracy, but this is real history. I'm not trying to spread conspiracies here. Washington's letters actually talk about this. Christina Richardson, I appreciate the donation. Thank you. What are your thoughts on the seemingly, wow, geez, really, thank you. What are your thoughts on the seemingly two-tier legal system in America? One of the left political elite. Sorry. What are your thoughts on the seemingly two-tier legal system in America? One for the left political elite and those who support them, like Silicon Valley, and another for everyday citizens. Why are the elites' various and intertwined crimes ignored or are not prosecuted? Well, I would say that is the sign of the inevitable collapse of a legal system where laws don't apply to everybody. This is not just an American phenomenon during this time. This has existed during the, say, periods of decline in most countries. And it does not, when I say decline, it does not mean, the end of the United States or something like that. Plenty of countries in history have gone through states of decline like that, and they bounced back from them. Read many books on this, for example. For example, 7 Military Classics of Ancient China. Tai Kung's 6 Secret Teachings, one of the military books. It was a guide for leaders and military leaders. And he talks about the need to ensure that law extends to everybody within the system. That he said, to be willing to punish the highest and to be willing to reward the lowest is a sign of a good leader. In other words, for example, Yu Fei, one of the great Chinese generals, was famous for having his own son executed when he broke a charge during a battle, which caused that charge to be lost, and a lot of men lost their lives. He was executed for that. And Yu Fei, this ancient Chinese general, was respected for that because it demonstrated that he was willing to enforce the law against even his own son. That anyone else would have been executed, even his own son was not exempt from that. His willingness to enforce the law, even when it hit deep personal interest, demonstrated his capabilities as a ruler. And that is the problem we have in our society today, is that a lot of people don't want to enforce the law when it ties to their own personal interest. That is a sign of a negative ruler. If they don't want to enforce the law when it ties to their friends or their family members or people within their own circles of influence. Throughout history, this has been an issue. It has been a sign of an upright government or a degenerate government. Many examples of this, even going back to ancient Rome. Many countries have dealt with this. It's an issue of leadership. I think that's the issue our country has now, though, is that there are people who selectively enforce the law. You could be charged for crimes on one side and be let off on the other, depending on which side of the political interest spectrum you fall under. That is the case, and there have been many countries in the past and many governments in the past that have dealt with the same issue. And again, I think for the U.S. to restore justice, it needs to demonstrate that there are not two laws in this country. Everybody is held to the same system of laws. And I really believe that if the people in our institutions, whether they be government officials or FBI agents and so on, who've committed crimes, if they're held accountable for what they've done, if they're found guilty, I think that will restore the faith in the institutions in this country. I think at some point that does need to happen, because I think the average American, we generally understand that there's a lot of corruption in our government, and until that is fixed, a lot of people aren't going to fully trust the government. And that was actually what Trump campaigned on the first time around, was drain the swamp, right? And so I think, I think for the sake of this country, it does need to be demonstrated at some point that there is one system of law in this country, and both sides need to be held accountable to it. Winnie Shi Poo. It's getting late. 11:16, but we'll keep going. Winnie Shi Poo. I appreciate the donation as always. Thank you. You are courageous and an honorable man for holding to your values of truth and justice. Appreciate it. Thank you. What are your thoughts about the U.S. potentially reverse subverting the CCP, essentially getting them to show their hand a slow play? It's hard with them because they're so cunning. You could lead them into a trap. You could make them kind of implode. If you were to ask me, subverting them wouldn't work. I don't think subverting them would work, to be honest. They know these games, and they're too cunning for it. I don't think it would work. What does work with them, though, is ideology. What does work with them is truth, because really, if you've built a system of lies, its biggest weak point is going to be truth. There's a reason why they censor the internet. There's a reason why in China they try to control news outlets, why every individual is monitored, why you're restricted from saying things. Because when you allow for open discourse, well, the ideas that cannot withstand open discourse tend to collapse, which is why I think there's so much censorship in America right now. If you let people debate openly, ideas that can't withstand criticism, they go away. And you can have a system that artificially protects ideas that should not exist because they can't withstand the natural order of things. Communism being one of them, socialism being one of them, and the types of controls they put in place to make sure that people don't criticize these systems. Why do you have these types of social controls under every one of these dictatorships it forms? It's because the things they do and the acting out of their systems can't withstand scrutiny. I really think that if the United States wants to take down the CCP, they can call it the crimes of the CCP. They can call it the history of the CCP. They can expose what the leaders have done and these types of things. Personally, I do think it's very possible the Chinese Communist Party has a lot of blackmail information on a lot of powerful people in the world. Just knowing, writing about this for years, they do these things, including honey traps, like sex traps, for example. This is basic espionage 101. In fact, there was a really interesting interview several years back with a former Russian spy who was a woman, who talked about how she did sex traps to get different elites involved in these types of things. And it was a public story. This was before any of this was considered controversial, funny enough. These days people think you're talking about conspiracy theory. People think you're talking conspiracy theory if you talk about this stuff these days. But going back to prior to Trump, these things were pretty openly talked about. The idea of honey traps was not considered conspiracy. You could read plenty of government reports warning about it. There was one, anyways, back to the point, there was this former Russian spy. It was a woman, and she's talking about how she ran these types of operations. She said something very kind of dark, but very interesting, which is she said the concept is very simple. in the West, you ask your men to lay down their lives for their country. And in Russia, the women are also asked to lay down for their countries. In other words, sleeping with people for the sake of sex traps. It's the same concept. And so, no, she said, in the West, you ask men to stand up for their countries. In Russia, we ask women to lay down for their countries. I think that's how it was framed. Oh, wow. Batfly, I really appreciate the donation. Thank you. And really, very much so. All right. Moving on from Jay Otterson. Appreciate the donation. Thank you. Will putting our military influence or soldiers out in the Middle East benefit CCP? I think so. There were some really interesting reports early on where the Chinese Communist Party basically, it's funny. I wanted to write stories about this for a long time, and I could never really do it because it was often on the kind of rumor end, and you could see elements of it, and it was hard to prove. But I had many sources tell me the Chinese Communist Party was basically playing a game in the Middle East when the U.S. was involved in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And China went in and basically was making business deals, infrastructure deals. They had mining operations while they were pretending to be, backing the international movements to oppose these, to help in these, quote unquote, nation building efforts. They were using it for their own personal gain. And one of the things they were doing was they were using these things to keep the U.S. distracted, keep the U.S. focused on the Middle East so they don't deal with China. Same way that they used North Korea, for example. Anytime there was a big international dispute between the United States and China, what happens? Well, North Korea comes out and threatens nuclear, holocaust against the whole world. And then, that becomes the focus of the entire international news cycle. And then China is the friendly negotiator that can work as the go-between between the U.S. and North Korea. Then the U.S. gives a big care package to Korea to, silence them for a bit longer. That's how it was usually played. A lot of conflicts in the world are not really what they seem to be. There's a lot more behind a lot of them, and it's a dark and complicated picture when you get into it. The Middle East being one of them. And look at how quickly a lot of these things were resolved. Actually, once Trump came in, ironically, you might remember. Oh, wow, Dark Father, appreciate the donation. You might remember ISIS, right? During the Obama administration, this was an issue that was not going to go away. It was a complicated problem that could not be easily solved. What happened to ISIS? Any of you hear about ISIS lately? Anyways, all right, moving on. Greg Swamp Rhino Remover 2020. Thank you for the donation. Hi, Josh. Can you tell us about the hammer and the deep state manipulating votes? I have not heard about the hammer, to be honest. Deep state manipulating votes. That's hard to say. I do think there are a lot of groups interested in manipulating votes. Honestly, if I talk about it, they'll probably ban my channel or something. You could watch the videos from James O'Keefe at Project Veritas. You could read some articles pre-Trump about different forms of that took place. It's hard to talk about it these days because they try to they'll block your video or something like that. I do think there are issues like this, though. I do think there are serious issues like this. And there have been a lot of reports on it talking about different forms of fraud taking place in different parts of the country. And if you take all these together and put them all together, you see a pretty big picture. Brian Johnston, wow, thank you for the donation. I signed the Epoch Times petition to end the CCP. Keep up the good work. Oh yeah, so many folks asked about that too. We have a petition calling for, basically calling for an end to the Chinese Communist Party. If you all want to check that out, it's in the description below. I think some people asked, what do we use the info for? I don't think we use it for anything. It's more like just a public statement type thing. And just because people want to see that these are real people behind it, we do ask for a bit of info like that, but we don't use it for anything. So you're all good. Let's see here. Cayman Hunter, can you talk about how communism used to be somewhat a religion and its principles are taught like a religion? Yeah. Great book on that would be the 9 Commentaries on the Communist Party, published by the Epoch Times. And do I have a copy of it here? I do not have a copy of it here, but I do have The Specter of Communism is Ruling Our World, available on the Epoch Times shop for all you interested. It's in 3 different books, which are sold as a single package. This does go into that. Now, if we go back to the time of Marx, communism was it was not an economic theory. It was a metaphysical theory. It was about metaphysics and ontology. It was not intended to be an economic theory. It was an idea of the nature of the world. It was viewed as the solution to the atheist, rising atheist ideas and the cult of reason under the French Revolution and all these other things. Batfly, thank you. Appreciate the donation. You have to know about the. I can go on all night talking about this. Joe B, thank you. I appreciate it. Feelings hurt, Joshua. You read my name and not my question. Sorry about that. Let me highlight it. See if I can get to it. So you have to forgive me sometimes. I miss the. I just can't get to all the questions sometimes. I do apologize for that. All right, let me get back to my ideas, though. Yes. Now, if you want to read about the history of communism, the living soul of Marxism would be dialectical materialism, which was a metaphysical theory. It was based on the idea of Hegelian dialectics, which was also a metaphysical theory, based in the idea of the negation of the negation, the idea of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. The idea of the negation was like the course of life. Sorry. The idea of the course of life of anything applied to lives and applied to nature and applied to political systems. For example, through the negation of the egg, the chicken is born. Through the negation of the seed, the plant is born. That through the casting off of a structure, something else is created. And they believed that was part of the evolutionary process of life. That was the Hegelian dialectic, part of it, the idea of the negation. Marx took that and said, well, if that is the case, if evolution is based off the casting off of an old system, then by that same principle, the casting off of pre-existing institutions should bring about social evolution. We can blossom into the flower of civilization or something like that. And so Marx talked about the casting off of old ideas, of institutions, of religion, of political systems, of countries, the destruction of all existing institutions, morality, the family, all these things, in order to create a new system. And what would that system be? Well, you have to cast it off first. If you want to know what's in it, you have to pass it, right? That was the idea. And if you go back into history of the history of this, it's very interesting. Actually, socialism and communism, they were used interchangeably prior to the Bolshevik Revolution. Prior to the Bolshevik Revolution, these were not seen as different. These were not seen as different ideologies. Socialism was just the system that it takes during the process of creating communism. Communism was like the mythical goal, the guiding belief that drove it forward. That was the idea. If you go back to the time of Marx, there were many different competing ideas of socialism and communism, of what it would look like. You had for example, the Owenites. For example, I have it here. The Owenites, for example, the communist societies existing in the United States. Some of the creepiest books you'll ever read were about the Owenites. One of the proposals right alongside Marxism was the Church of Communism, which was a direct religious system, which was a satanic system. You could read, the History of Austrian Economics, Volume 2, I believe it is, where it talks about this. And it talks about the final synthesis of God into Satan, the exact words, as being part of the goal of that system. And they talked about, for example, establishing the Church of Communism and the communist pope and communist bishops and communist hymns and all these things. I won't go too deep into this. I could go all night into this. Basically, if you want to read a good history on this, I can't find it. Ludwig von Mises, I often recommend it. Oh, here it is. Ludwig von Mises, Socialism. It's very good. Talks about this. Also, Spectre of Communism is Ruling Our World, published by the Epoch Times, is very good. There are unfortunately very few books that talk about this history. Some of you have asked if I'd ever write a book. I would like to write one. And it's what I would like to write about is the history of ideology. Actually, I don't know if I'll get to it anytime soon. But you really can't understand the rise of communism without understanding the history of Gnosticism. You can't understand, for example, these things without understanding the Rosicrucian uprising. Them releasing these pamphlets in Europe, I think around 1700s, saying they were going to start a movement to destroy religion and religions and kings and so on. You can't understand, for example, the rise of Rasputin without understanding what took place ahead of 666, because he had mass panic. A lot of people thought 666 the world is going to end 1666, and you had a lot of really freaky things start up in Europe, including suicide cults and a really growing interest in the dark occult, which led to Rasputin and different, especially movements in Russia, which later on played a big influence into these things. You can't understand the rise of socialism without understanding, for example, Francois Noël Gracchus Babeuf. You can't understand him without understanding the Cercle Social. You can't understand them without understanding the, for example, what do you call them? The Carbonari, for example. The history of ideology into the Abeginsians, these old heresies, you could call them, and the influence these ideas played in Europe. You can't understand naturism or the Enlightenment or any of these things without knowing this history. And I don't think there's any one book that talks about it, actually. And this has been a problem I've had, and it's something I would like to write one day. We'll see if I ever get around to it. You can trace it. There are a lot of books on it, but none of them really put it all together. And so when you get into Marx, remember that Engels and Hegel were both Hermeticists. And if you understand the teaching, what Hermeticism gets into and what it taught, and understand the idea of how Marx took that and flipped it around even, the picture is very interesting. It's a lot different than what a lot of people would think, what these things actually are. Another great book, actually. Funny enough. The Devil and Karl Marx by Paul Kengor, who I'm going to have on the show coming up very soon, so stick around for that. He agreed to the interview. Hopefully we'll get him on this week. Maybe we'll air it next week just because the elections are coming up. All right, folks, it's 11:33, so I'm going to end it here, but I could go on all night, and I apologize. I couldn't get to all the questions. Again, it's always a problem. Yeah, Zoroastrianism. The Manichaean cults as well was a big part of all this as well. The history of it's very interesting. I wish there was one book that had it all, but there's not one that I know of. Sorry, folks. I go on. I really apologize. I can't get to all the questions every time. All right, so let me give a couple updates for the coming week. So Tuesday, the elections, November 3rd, I'm going to be doing like a 7-hour live, 6 or 7 hour live for the elections. So tune in for that. You can watch me drown myself in coffee and maybe sneak a donut between takes or something like that. We'll be giving live election coverage through NTD and Epoch Times, and I'll be one of the main hosts of that. We'll be going on for however long it takes. Maybe 6 hours or 7 hours, we'll have to see. Also, I have some great interviews coming up. Paul Kengor, the author of that book I just mentioned. Many others. Bill Whittle is going to be on. Working on a few others as well. David Rubin agreed to an interview, actually. I'm going to be out in California, hopefully hanging out with him for a bit. Mason Musso, you might remember during the whole emo craze, when emo was popular, he was one of the big bands back there, with one of the big bands back then, Metro Station. He's an interesting character these days. He's a pretty cool dude. I'm going to go interview him. I'm also going to be going to the border. I'm doing some border coverage. I'm going to go to the smuggling tunnels they have there. It's funny that we're arranging with the Border Patrol right now because you have to go through them. Oh, wow. KF Plumblind, I appreciate the donation. Thank you. It's funny. You have to go through them for these things. And, we arranged to go check out the smuggling tunnels there. We're going to talk about human trafficking and stuff. And, when they were telling me about this, I was like, oh, cool. Like, I'm thinking the movies where, you ever see that Navy SEAL movie? I can't remember the name of it was, where they go into these smuggling tunnels and you could fit like 4 people, standing shoulder to shoulder. And that's what I'm picturing in my mind. They're like, oh yeah, well you have to like crawl into it, these types of things. So, my image of it changed quite a bit, but I'm going to go crawl into a smuggling tunnel for you guys after the week after the elections. And so you can look forward to that. I'll be having some other coverage like that. And anyways, good stuff lined up. Again, be sure to tune in on Tuesday because we're going to do we're going to do all day, most of the night election coverage, and we should be live the whole time. So come hang out with us. Enjoy it. Anyways, folks, R. Williams, I'm sorry. I don't mean to ignore you guys. Sometimes when I'm talking, I try to get too distracted by the comments too much. I try to read them, but not go on tangents too much. And I try to keep it at an hour. I'm already over an hour. And anyways, I do really, I wish I could get to all your questions, and I do really apologize when I can't. If I did, they'd keep coming in, and I'd probably be here all night, and I'd keep you all here all night. But it's not personal, and I do apologize. I really wish I could get to all of them. I'll make an effort, of course. Someone's asking I should interview Jordan Peterson. Actually, I sent a request to Jordan Peterson last week, actually. We'll see if he gets back to me. Actually, I did interview him before. One of the big videos where he talks about postmodernism, and he's in his apartment, he's in his home, and you could see that the masks he has in the background. That was actually me interviewing him. The Epoch Times interview, you can see the watermark. I was actually interviewing him on that one. Unfortunately, that was like one of the first video interviews I did, and we just didn't have a good setup for it, and so I didn't have my side of the camera. What we did was we had a camera crew go to his house, and they put a laptop on a chair. They put a laptop on a chair, and they had me on Skype talking with him in his own home. It was kind of a funny setup, but yeah, if you want to watch the interview I did with Jordan Peterson, you can look up Jordan Peterson postmodernism, and it's the really high quality. We had a real high quality camera setup. It's the video we did in his home. And again, I requested a follow-up with him just last week. We'll see if he responds to that. I hope he does. All right, folks. Anyways, I always enjoy these lives with you all. And I'd like to do more. Well, we'll have to see how this channel develops over time. This is actually my favorite format, to be honest. But anyways, good interviews coming up, good reporting covering coming up. Live all day long, maybe all night. We'll have to see. 6 or 7 hours for the election day. So tune in for that. Anyways, folks, as always, take care of yourselves. I think we changed it recently. I don't know if you noticed. It's stay informed and stay free. The show's slogan keeps changing, but I like this one. So anyways, folks, again, stay informed, stay free. Thank you. Appreciate it.